As I record this, the premiere of The Book of Boba Fett is only 10 days away. The thing that grabbed me right away when I first saw the trailer for it was that it opened with a Bomar monk skittering in front of Jabba's palace. Now, we have no idea whether these will actually play a meaningful part in the series, but it's already more than they had in Return of the Jedi, and it seems to be sparking some renewed interest in the Bomar monks. And it's probably not a coincidence that Hex 3D decided to release a 3D model for the Bomar monk as part of their Patreon, so I decided this would be the perfect time to print and finish it myself. And here are some of the parts that make up the model. You can see that he included parts for the dome, which houses the monk's disembodied brain, but as I've found in previous videos, it's difficult to make something completely transparent with 3D printing, so we'll come back to that in a minute. He included parts for all 6 legs, as well as unbroken versions if you wanted to print them all in one piece, but I actually thought that would be more difficult to print, even though I do have technically a printer that's large enough to handle it. This is the dome that I printed using transparent resin, and as you can see, while it is transparent, it's not really that clear, and this is after spraying it several times with clear coat to really try and give it the best shot. But I decided that this was not going to work for the model, and I would need to come up with an alternative. After a little searching, I found these do-it-yourself Christmas ornaments that seemed like they would be perfect. You can take the hanger portion off and just cut off this mouth section, and it should be very similar in size and shape to the actual supplied part, although slightly larger. So I decided I would just scale everything up by about 10% and print them that way. At first I used flush cutters to widen the mouth of the ornament, and that did work, but it was a little bit tedious. Then I picked one of these razor saws up, and they're very handy actually, and it made short work of this task. And here are all the parts printed. I printed them all on the Elegoo Mars 3, with the exception of the large abdomen section there in the back, which I did on the Saturn because it wouldn't fit on the Mars. Since this model has to be held up by just 6 thin legs, I was a little concerned that this back piece in particular would be too heavy, so I printed it with just a 1mm wall and totally hollow, and while we did have a couple cracks in a couple places, it printed quite well overall. You can see if I push on it, it kind of gives almost like a stiff balloon. So it's relatively light for its size. The body is supplied in 2 halves like this that you're supposed to glue together, but I had trouble getting the halves to come together properly. They were always a little bit off, so I decided to join the 2 halves digitally and then just print that model, and that worked much better. I'll show you that in a bit, but first I wanted to show you how the model fits together. There's this joining piece here that goes in the back. Then you've got a neck portion that goes in the front, and a little sort of cap for the brain bowl that attaches to that, as you can see here. The legs are in 3 sections, as I showed you earlier, and they fit together pretty easily. I was thinking I might have to use some paper clips or something and drill holes to reinforce those joins, as I sometimes do when building models, but in the end I was able to use superglue and it worked just fine. I am glad that I used Elegoo's ABS-like resin though, because it's stronger and less brittle. One of the biggest problems I had in assembling this model was the legs. It looked like you were supposed to sort of push these into ball joints in the body, but I've never used any kind of resin that would be flexible enough to actually make this kind of construction work, and they just wouldn't fit in there. So I decided to snip this little ball portion of the leg off and drill a hole into the leg and into the body using a pin vise, which is just a little handheld drill that modelers will sometimes use. This is the version of the body that I combined into 2 and then reprinted, and I took that opportunity to add some holes here so I wouldn't have to drill so many holes. And all I needed now was something to connect the body with the legs, so I went with something that I have often used as a modeler. I used a paperclip, but this was an especially large version. This is like a 4-inch long paperclip with much thicker wire, and I was really hoping that that would be strong enough to hold this whole thing up from the legs. Even these big thick paper clips are relatively easy to cut. You just need a pair of pliers and bend them back and forth a few times and they'll come right off, and then you can use that as your reinforcement in your model. After I did 6 of those, I superglued them into the body and then put glue on the other end so that I could attach the leg with a hole in it like that, and it worked actually surprisingly well. I didn't have to do a lot of finishing work with putty or anything, but I did have these drain holes that I had added to the tail section so that the resin wouldn't pool inside. So I did add a little bit of Tamiya putty there, and also a little bit on the legs between the joints. After that was dried and sanded, I just had to assemble everything. I used epoxy glue for these joins just to make them a little bit more strong. And this was kind of the moment of truth because I wasn't sure until I put all these parts on whether it would be able to stand up under its own weight or not, although I had kind of experimented with it a little bit. And the first impression was that it would be just fine. It seemed like the thicker paper clips were holding pretty well. But I did find, after I had left the model sort of standing on its own legs overnight, that it had fallen down because the legs had kind of gradually slipped out of position, so they were no longer splayed wide enough to actually support the model. And I thought this was more a problem of just getting the legs to stay in place than having them be stronger. So I decided to add a base, and the first thing I did was to just take a piece of foam core and poke some holes in it where I thought the legs should go, and just see if that seemed to solve the problem, and it did. So I decided to make a base for it. But we'll get to that in a little bit after we've finished the rest of the model. After spraying the model black, I took a little gunmetal paint mixed with black to make it a little bit less silvery, and just dry brushed the entire model with that to bring out some of the details and make it look a little bit less monochrome. And I think it worked really well, and it was super easy to do. Not really a difficult paint job at all this time. With that done, I had to move on to what was probably the most difficult part, the brain bowl. I knew I wanted to fill it with resin of some kind to make it look like there was liquid inside. Since I had all of these materials on hand already, I decided to go with this clear polyester casting resin from Cast and Craft, which smells like death, and this is the Cast and Craft catalyzer, which you add to make it harden. I also had these Let's Resin pigments for resin that I would use to color the resin as well. I had to do this process several times, as it turned out, because I wasn't satisfied with how the end product looked, as I'll show you in a minute. Here I was adding a couple of drops of the orange and 1 drop of the red, and this ended up a little bit too opaque for my tastes, so I think maybe 1 of each is about right. After thoroughly mixing up the resin, I added the brain to the bowl and put it on a little stand that I improvised out of a 3D printing filament spool and added the resin. And as you can see, I didn't paint the brain or do anything to it because I figured it would be obscured enough by the resin that it wouldn't actually matter. And as a matter of fact, gray might actually be the best choice of color. Before I show you how that ended up, let me show you one of my failures. This one, I printed the brain at the same size that they originally said to print it at, and I painted it in a more realistic pinkish color. But as you can see, if I turn it to the side here, it looks just gigantic. It seems that the way this ornament refracts light really enlarged the brain more than I thought it would. There's also a lot of bubbles there. And I didn't also really tint the liquid or resin nearly as much as I should have because I was afraid of going overboard. And so basically this is exactly the opposite of what I want in almost every way. But it was a learning experience for sure. This next one is the one that you saw me pouring the resin for with 3 drops of the pigment, and it doesn't look too bad, but if you're not looking with a bright light as we are here, it's very difficult to see the brain in there. So in the end, I decided to go with 1 drop of each of the colors of pigment, 1 orange and 1 red, and that's what you have here, and that seems to be the best version that I could come up with. You can still see the brain in there pretty clearly, but not too clearly. You can't really tell that it's unpainted. And of course, I also printed it smaller. This is around 85% of the original size. I also tried doing this with just 1 drop of orange just to see what it would look like, which is this here, but it looked a little bit like, well, like something else, and I wasn't entirely satisfied with that, so I'm not going to be using this one. You may recall that Hasbro released two different versions of the Bomar Monk in action figure form. They had this one in the Jabba's Denizen set that had a kind of a, well, really a pinkish fluid in it, and this one as a mail-away that had blue fluid in it. And I thought it might be kind of an interesting little homage to this figure if I created an alternative version of the bowl that had blue fluid in it. So that's what I did, and I determined actually that it would be pretty easy to add magnets to the lid of the brain bowl and the neck of the figure so that I could swap out the different colors of brain bowl anytime I wanted. And I'll show you that in a little while. And here's the finished blue version without the lid on it. Once these cured, it took a couple of days, but once they did, they seemed to work quite well, and there's not even really very many visible bubbles or anything like that. Here you can see the magnets that I put on the underside of the lid. I just used a disposable brush to apply some epoxy glue just to part of the lid here that would come in contact with the brain bowl and put them together, and that was it. Since this was originally a Christmas ornament after all, it would seem like a missed opportunity if I didn't take one of my reject versions and actually make a Christmas ball out of it. So that's what I did. I just fit in the original hanger on the top there, but I thought it looked a little bit too silvery, so I colored it in with a Sharpie and then wiped a lot of that off with a paper towel to make something that seemed a lot more close in style to the rest of the piece. And this one's actually hanging on our Christmas tree as we speak, and I think it actually fits in fairly well. Probably most people wouldn't even notice that there's a brain in there. Certainly my wife hasn't. Back to the base, I went to Michael's and got one of these wooden plaques that they sell, and it seemed about the right size. Then I arranged the legs the way they wanted them and marked where I thought the holes should go. Then, because I have apparently completely lost the charger for my drill, I used my hand drill to make a little starter hole here and then widened it out with my flush cutters, which is really not the ideal way to go about this, but actually seemed to work just fine. I really just wanted to make a very shallow hole that the legs could slot into and keep them from kind of sliding around. After I had 6 appropriately sized holes that I was confident would work for these legs, I put some little sticks in them just temporarily to ensure that they didn't get filled in. Then I mixed some glue and sand to cover the top of the base. Then I just used my gloved hands to kind of spread it around and cover the entire top of the base. The idea, of course, is to make a sandy-looking base for the Bomar Monk to stand on, something like might be just outside Jabba's palace. After it had dried for a few hours but was not completely dry, I went in with my hands and kind of just tried to wrinkle it up in a way because it looked very flat and unnatural to me. So I wanted to make a little bit of texture there and give a little bit of visual interest. And I made sure that the legs would actually work in these holes, and they seemed to be just fine, so I went ahead with the painting process, first priming it in gray, and then painting the top with a light brown, which I highlighted in a lighter brown, just the same color mixed with white. And finally, I did the sort of bottom border in black. It was a very simple paint job, but I think it actually works really well. And here is the final product. It may be a little bit difficult to judge scale, so I've put them next to the Sideshow Collectibles 1/6 scale Bib Fortuna figure. And you can see the Bomar Monk is probably around 13 inches tall, which seems just about the right size. This is an interesting project because most of the problems I encountered were sort of an engineering variety, I guess you'd say, trying to make sure that things would stand up and, fit together properly as opposed to just painting them to look nice. I was a little worried that the magnets might not be strong enough to hold these on here because the resin is fairly heavy, but it seems to be fine. And here we can get another look at the final version of the brain bowl. This is sort of the standard version, I guess you'd say. And then we can put on the blue version if we want. Interestingly, because the blue version is more transparent, it actually reflects the rest of the droid there in the background. Looks like there's a spider inside it or something, but that's actually just the reflection. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with how this all turned out. You can see it just snaps right on there and seems to have no problem standing under its own weight. So I'm pretty interested to see if these have a significant role in the Book of Boba Fett, or if it was just something that appeared in the trailer. And I'd like to know also if they change any of the backstory that previously existed for these, like what they are and what they're doing there in the palace. Let me know if you have any theories about that in the comments below. By the way, if you're not subscribed, I'd really appreciate it if you would. And if you'd like to go one step further and help support the channel, you can do what these Palace VIPs and my other patrons have done, which is to join me on Patreon, where you can support the channel for as little as $1 a month and get behind-the-scenes posts, early videos, and more. Thanks for watching.